I think about death way too much because no matter what I do, no matter who I am, eventually everything is just...
I'm sitting on the edge of the ocean.
Ernest Hemingway once said that everyone has two deaths, one when you're buried in the ground and the other when people forget your name, and in that way some men can become immortal. I don't know who the last person to remember my name will be, but I know that most people only start feeling fulfilled when they feel like they're part of something bigger that will last beyond them. For a lot of people, that's kids, family, not only biologically continuing on, but some semblance of the way you think and believe. The moment, and it might just be because my hormones haven't demanded I continue the forthright charge of humanity into the future, that just doesn't do it for me yet. For me, I only started feeling fulfilled in what I was doing when I started making writing videos, when I was making educational stuff, because education and knowledge is so much bigger than I am. The human engine of knowledge is much greater than the sum of its parts. We have a term in YouTube circles for educational content that never goes out of fashion: evergreen, but I prefer immortal. Not because I feel like everyone's going to be watching my videos forever, but because when I see comments from people that say, hey, you really helped me, that is the most meaningful thing that I can see. On a fundamental level, the only immortality we ever achieve is through other people. We all look for our own immortality and our own way to interface with death. Like, I had a distinct moment when I started making those videos where I was like, oh wow, yeah, no, this is what I want to do. So I wrote a story about death. It's about this family who have this ancient book made of like wax and feathers, and inside the book there's a family tree, but it's constantly growing. Like, as you grow, you get a little branch, and when you die, a little raven comes home to roost and the branch ends. And when you have a kid, you get a branch coming off you. This family lives directly alongside death in the way we all live alongside death, but every member in this family deals with that book, with death, differently. Her grandmother deals with the book with this kind of religious reverence that this relationship with death makes them special, and that's one way we deal with facing that, you know? It makes us arrogant. We give ourselves a special place in this. We make it important. That's why we go to heaven and the dogs don't, right? It becomes something grand, so much more than a book. But how does the grandmother die? The old woman was in her bed, mouth agape, shoes covered in drool and puke that had dripped out the side of her mouth. My grandfather suffered from Parkinson's for years before he died. My grandmother declined into dementia before she finally passed. I don't think I need to speak to the horror of that, but that's why the saddest thing about death isn't always the end point, the ceasing. We have no concept of that. It's the inescapable backward slide into nothing. So maybe Ernest Hemingway was wrong. We don't have two deaths. We have 1,000, one for each memory we lose, one for each function till we cease being ourselves. Death is not an instant, but a process, and we try to tell ourselves it's transformative, that we come out the other side, but I don't know if I'm convinced. Ultimately, we can care more about dignity than death, because we can lose dignity, we can only inherit death. And that's also why so many ways people try to find immortality are also them trying to find a sense of dignity. It's dignified to die for your country, for your ideals, for being a valuable member of this civilization. But it's also no wonder we so often frame death with reverence and religion. It's a gift. It's necessary. It's a reminder of our place. It is just one life before the next. We see now through a glass darkly, but in the next life we will see clearly. And it's that sort of deeply embedded human emotions in so much of this that makes the architecture of that way of thinking hard for me to swallow, more so than it was in the past. The mother, on the other hand, obsesses over the book, over death. She flicks through it every single day, watching her little branch extend inch by inch, trying to guess when it might come for her. She becomes detached from reality in a way, distant from her family, and this is another way we deal with death, by getting really attached to it. Like, some people write stories about death and think about it too much and put it into their stories and make videos about the story. You know, as if thinking about it as much as possible is going to prepare us for it. It's going to make it easier when it comes. It's going to make that little backslide eventually just a little easier and smoother or shorter. And it won't. Or they try to find ways to avoid it. I saw this guy spent millions on like de-aging, and he would spend every day eating the perfectly healthy food. And I don't know if you can be super happy just eating broccoli every day for the rest of your life, and kale and quinoa, all in hopes he might save himself a year later than life. But I mean, that's a bet that I'm not going to necessarily take, because ultimately the universe holds all the cards. In a sense, these people excuse themselves of the world. They don't live in the now. They live in this hypothetical 1 year in the future. But this story is me thinking about death. It is me thinking about the future. And it's called The Life and Death of Lucia's Library. And then there's Lucia. She grows up with this book. She is reverent towards it, like her grandmother tells her, and she is also kind of obsessed with it like her mother is, but she takes her own path. She comes to hate this book after losing her daughter, because, you know, one way we try to deal with our own non-existence is to rationalize it and normalize it, moralizing and justifying it to make it seem existentially important, but that illusion can also be shattered. The more strictures you put around it to make it easier to swallow, the more things there are to shatter in the way you look at the world. Lucia didn't understand how someone could earn death, but as she aged into parenthood herself and had Maria, she came to see how a person could deserve life, more than herself, more than anyone else in the whole world, and reasoned some people must deserve the opposite. But this is also kind of irrational. Being angry or obsessive or fearful or glorifying it does give it power over us, and sometimes we lose ourselves in that. We go from trying to find a way to coexist with our own non-existence, which is something we all need, to not being able to live in a happy and healthy way that changes the way we look at ourselves and the world. And ultimately, Lucia tries to leave all of those different things behind. 60 years later, a crow came to roost for her as well. The pages ran out, and Lucia was glad of it. She smiled as death glided down the hallway towards her, great wings folded behind her, candle wax in her footsteps. Lucia smiled because she could finally tell death how little she thought of her. What days had she taken? None. The cursed tree had grown as tall as it ever would. It was time to let it die. The ugly book would die with her. The only victory we can have over death is coming to terms with it, and I'm not entirely sure how to do that. Is it possible to come to terms with something we cannot truly experience? Because when you're young, death feels like this far off thing. It's something that happened in the past to other people, to others. Of course, for many people, it's too real too quickly, and sometimes we escape into obsessing and fearing and glorifying as a way to deal with that. I also know that for some people dealing with suicidal ideation, death is a final escape route. It's an escape hatch out of the bottom of reality, not necessarily because people desire it. One of the things a lot of people don't understand about suicidal ideation is that it's often not that people desire it, but that having the option in the first place is a form of power to a lot of people. It's a form of having control in a circumstance where they don't feel like they have a lot of control. And to get out of a mindset where that is the escape hatch, you need to find another escape hatch that goes somewhere else to something better and more important. And that is really hard a lot of the time, because when you're at the point where that is the escape hatch, it often doesn't look like there's anything else down there with you. All the things that are paper thin and temporary and don't have the sense of permanence that the isolation and suffering does. Trying to change your relationship with death when you're at that point is so often so deeply tied up in changing your circumstances and figuring out who you are again, rediscovering joy and rediscovering a sense of hope that good things can stay around and things can change. But if you are struggling with suicidal ideation or other sorts of negative thoughts, I've left some links down the description. Getting help is so important, mostly because it allows us to sort of reframe and get an outside point of view. And it's easy to get trapped in our own way of looking at the world. I write about mental health and death and endings and the way to grapple with that, because that's what I think about a lot. And they're important topics to me. And, you know, this is just one in this story. I've got another story called A Worm Beneath the Skin, which deals very directly with self-harm. But the stories as a whole deal with death and endings and trying to find hope in between. Where to find hope in the existential reality of eventual and certain non-existence. But also the reality of the sufferings of every day. This story, The Life and Death of Lucia's Library, is one of my favorite ones I've ever written. I always wanted to write this magical, realist, intergenerational story. I'd love to share it with you. It's in this, I guess I can say now, Pushcart Prize nominated book, which is in the links down the description below. These stories are deeply personal to me. You can think of them like diary entries in so many ways, and I would love to share them with you. If you have read the story, the full story, because there's a lot more to it than I talked about in this video, I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. And I want to know, how do you feel about and deal with death?
I'm sitting on the edge of the ocean, and I'm seeing all the bright stars. So please try to imagine that you are a great part of my heart. So please don't go, please don't go, don't go, please don't go, don't go, please don't go too far. I'm sitting